Mountain biking fork legs getting thicker isn't about stiffness. Well, it's not totally about stiffness. Fork legs have got bigger in diameter consistently since the inception of mountain biking as a general trend. Now, this could be solely put down to the fact that your average trail bike has more travel than ever before and with a slacker head angle. The longer the fork, the longer the lever. So if we're riding two bikes in the exact same way, putting the exact same forces through the axle, the longer fork would have more flex and leverage over those bushes and that crown steerer unit, which would then not be good for either performance or the longevity of the fork. So it is true, the longer the fork, the stiffer it needs to be. And if we had a flexible fork, the longer it got, the worse the problem would be. Longer forks do work better when they're thicker then, but is that the only reason?
Irrespective of travel, most forks are bigger in leg diameter than their like-for-like predecessors. But is it not only about stiffness?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, we've got an XC shock behind me and an aggressive sort of all-mountain enduro shock. Now, that shock will descend better than that one, and that's not about stiffness, but it's a hell of a lot bigger. So is the conversation dogged and muddied by this obsession with preventing flex? Well, of course, stiffness shouldn't be discounted. A larger fork leg will be stiffer, especially when you're riding hard, and that isn't a bad thing. But there are lots of factors when considering fork flex. The lower, the axle, the crown, where the bushes are, how thick the bushes are, the material. All these things will definitely play a part in how the fork feels under load and how good it is at resisting forces. For instance, the new 38 fork from X-Fusion compared to this 36 model is 20% stiffer. And that's something that I'm sure they've worked really hard over and sweated the details on to achieve that figure. But I just think the idea of, me mountain biker, me need stiff forks is a little bit played out and doesn't really do where the modern enduro fork has gotten to justice. It all comes down to real estate and packaging. Large volume forks enable other smaller but more important features to be able to offer something that is not only stiff, but that feels really, really good. This could be described as margarine gains.
I think you mean marginal.
As in a low cholesterol alternative to butter? I don't think so. This could then be described as marginal gains. But hold on just a minute. This video is partnered with X-Fusion and I need to disclose it. Toblerone, come and do your bloody job. I'm here with Pinkbike's partnership correspondent Toblerone to tell you that today's video has been made in collaboration with X-Fusion, and we thought we'd take a look inside their 38 Vengeance fork to see what's going on, as well as access a greater conversation about diameter and design. They have no control over scripting, and that's been down solely to Toblerone and I. But let's get him back to his nap. The first thing I want to talk about when discussing why larger diameter forks aren't only about stiffness is the air spring and how the ability to tune the relationship between positive and negative air chambers has been key to great forks across the board in recent years, but also how that has been exponentially helped by being able to have more space. Now, often the damper gets all the credit, but when it comes to your forks feeling supple, the negative air chamber and a sophisticated air spring do a huge amount. You see, dampers are exciting. There are clicks and dials and fluids, and words like velocity are thrown around like plates at a Greek wedding. While dampers do a lot and are so important in helping us fine-tune support and return speed, the nuances of the negative air chamber are one of the reasons that we have sensitive, fluttery forks that can still handle big hits. It's because of that tech that helps us make the most of our big, burly forks. Let me try and explain with a really basic, probably terrible experiment. Here I am on a seesaw. This is me. I weigh 80 kilograms, so if there's nothing on the other end, I'm sat at bottom out. So I put another 80 kilograms on the other end. Suddenly I'm no longer at bottom out the whole time, but it also doesn't take much for me to hit full travel. This would be like running 50% sag. The solution is obviously adding lots more weight on the other end. Now, this is great because if I were to hit something really hard, then I just get to full travel. The issue is now that I have so much weight on the other end, small inputs don't really make any difference, and I can't get the seesaw moving at all. The solution is adding a little more weight to my end to offset the high load on the other. Adding this weight isn't totally dissimilar to how a negative air chamber works. As you can imagine though, if we have a very small air chamber that gets larger, not smaller, as the fork is compressed, working opposite the positive chamber, its effects run out very quickly. So fork manufacturers have been working hard on this relationship, and simply having more space to work with means they can fine-tune the size of these chambers more, giving you a fluttery stroke no matter where you are in the travel, as well as plenty of bottom-out resistance. A lot of larger forks of the latest generation will use a cartridge inside the fork leg, a lot like this one, which has taken out a 38mm chassis, and upon first glance, it might even look a bit like a damper, but it's not. Using cartridges like this is all about giving engineers the freedom to balance the relationship between positive and negative air chambers and not be baked into the sizes given to them by that tube itself that typically, with your fork leg, has a seal running up and down the inside. Now, as that fork leg gets bigger, that piston inside can get quite large, and that might not necessarily be what gives the best performance. So, of course, this design, with these tailored chamber size as well as piston size, is more material. It's another tube inside what is already a metal tube, and so it's going to be bigger and heavier. But then again, if our bikes are getting bigger and heavier, it might be well suited towards its intention. Now, you're probably more familiar with the lighter solution, which is where the piston, like I said, slides up and down the inner side of the stanchion, which is far more typical in XC or trail forks. While these have become increasingly sophisticated over the years and can still offer very good performance, going to a cartridge system of a beefy enduro fork lets the relationship, the two chambers, just be tuned and tweaked more. Now, this is one reason for forks getting bigger that isn't really anything to do with stiffness. Of course, both systems can use volume spacers to adjust feel, but the importance of getting the base relationship right cannot be understated. So, is it wrong to have a piston that slides up and down the inside of the stanchion? Absolutely not. It's a very elegant solution that's also a lot lighter. What it comes down to is intention. But what's happening on the other side of the fork? So if we have different style air springs depending on the chassis size of our fork, is the same true of our dampers? Surely any mountain biking damper wants to be the most controlled with the most adjustment possible. Well, like anything, it's all about balancing priorities, and with more space, designers can simply do more. But let's start off by talking and thinking about how our damper works and what's happening inside them. Now, I would like to say Toblerone did these, but sadly it was me. Now, in these very crude diagrams, I just want to briefly explain what's happening inside our suspension dampers. So they're made up of three chambers. You have the displacement chamber, the compression chamber, and the rebound chamber. And these are all interlinked with one another. So here we have the damper relatively static. There is a small amount of pressure being put on the oil from this coil inside the displacement chamber. On shocks, they can also be nitrogen charged or air charged as a way of managing that pressure on the oil. Now, when you compress the fork, the oil in front of that piston is being pressurized. That means the pressure behind the piston is dropping, but there's oil on both sides. Then, when the shaft returns, suddenly the rebound chamber at the bottom, which you can see in red there, has a higher pressure than the compression chamber in purple. And this is really, really important to ensure consistency and performance in our forks. But why the hell do we need a displacement chamber? Well, first of all, it's because when we're at bottom out, there is more shaft in the oil, which then changes the oil volume, which is vitally important. If we didn't have that, our forks would pretty much immediately blow up. The second one is also really important. In a very, very simple example with this balloon, if we didn't have the appropriate level of pressure coming back to the oil, as our piston was moving through, it would just push the oil away. What we're trying to do with our piston and all that clever architecture is force oil through the circuitry, because then it can be damped and modulated. Now, engineers will put in a huge amount of work to understand the pressure from this section of the damper and how much it pushes back onto the oil. They will also carefully choose the size of the tube and the size of the piston. In this 38mm Vengeance fork, X-Fusion has worked hard to move to a larger piston to allow for greater piston flow, which sounds kind of daft, right? Why worry about flow through the piston if you're just going to limit it with compression and rebound shims anyway, right? Well, it's all about managing something called pressure balance. Pressure balance is about getting a setup that offers more control and sensitivity. Let me explain. Here, as I'm careful not to slosh it, we have some water, but let's pretend it's oil. We use oil in our suspension units because it's not compressible. You can sit on it or hit it with a cricket bat. It doesn't care. It ain't budging. Have you ever had a shock that had a step or a clunk in it? That is possibly because some air got in there somehow. Suspension tuners and manufacturers go to great lengths to make all their parts serviceable and easily bled, either by vacuum pump or by hand, to remove all of that air. Because air, unlike oil, is compressible, but sometimes it's not so simple. So I'm going to run my hand through this water. Now in front, you can see the pressure builds, and behind it, it leaves a wake where the pressure is less. We discussed this earlier on. But as I'm going through it, if you can imagine the front part being the compression chamber and behind being the rebound chamber, as I push through, oil is going to be flowing through my hand, through those very expensive and not at all meaty sausage fingers of our compression valve. And what that does is it lets the stroke rate be controlled. And as I return, it goes to the rebound shims, which do the same thing. Well, now I want you to imagine that if I move my hand fast enough through the oil, the pressure drops so much behind me that it creates a vacuum. Suddenly, it's pulling all those tiny amounts of air that were sat in the fluid all into one place under extreme force. Maybe such little amount you couldn't even tell by any noise or clicking. But this leaves us with a problem because air is very compressible. And so on the return stroke, we have lag. This is called cavitation, and it might disappear in an instant. So if you can have a better balance of pressure between the two chambers, you'll have a better footing to avoid cavitation and have a more consistently damped shock. If the cavitation was so bad, maybe a vacuum forms that is so strong it pulls air past a seal, and then you're going to have a bigger problem. So pressure balancing and managing the relationship in terms of what's happening either side of that piston will give you a fork damper that not only performs better, but also is more reliable. Now, I know what you might be thinking, air in my oil, what's that all about? Well, if you've ever bled any dot fluid breaks, you'll know how preparing the oil with the syringes is really important to getting a good bleed. And you can see as you pull the syringe there and you create a vacuum, suddenly it's pulling all that tiny amount of air out of the oil. This isn't totally dissimilar to what happens when there's a huge shaft speed ripping through our suspension fluid and in its wake, leaving a vacuum. You'll also know that these air bubbles don't appear when you push the syringe lever and the fluid is compressed. Compressing the oil is a key part of the displacement chamber and is one of the tasks that we spoke about earlier on. It not only preloads the oil, but can also handle, as the name would suggest, the displacement that happens as pressure builds within the system and the volume changes, giving oil pressure that is not only more consistent in terms of pressure, but also better balanced on both sides of the piston. Understanding that this incredibly high axle speed is more likely to happen on bikes that we ride incredibly hard is a consideration that brands will be focused on when developing the gravity dampers, which is why gravity dampers in bigger forks are a lot burlier. They have more space and more oil and more material, and that means engineers quite simply need more space so they can focus on the high-end damping without the consideration as making it as small as possible. Using a small piston for that application restricts the oil flow, making tuning more specific and less flexible. It also reduces the amount of adjustment able to be built in within the system. Less oil flowing means there's less flow to modulate. So that tends to be why you need a bigger damper on bigger forks and that's handy because we also want those forks to be stiffer too. So are big forks all about stiffness? No. But stiffness plays a very important role. However, it's a happy marriage of convenience because the forks we need the most volume in terms of design and the most space to implement the tech we want, we have because it's also the biggest chassis. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll catch you next time.